74 ballistic missiles. 11 minutes, 9 launch platforms scattered across western Iran. Mobile launchers mounted on trucks that had spent 3 weeks repositioning exclusively at night, hiding under bridges, slipping into mountain ravines, specifically to deny satellite intelligence that U.S. planners updated every 6 hours. 74 objects on converging trajectories toward a single hull, the USS Gerald R. Ford. The aircraft carrier is the largest ever built. 100,000 tons of American power projection, 5,200 people on board. That was what Iran decided to attack. And before anyone asks why, you have to go back to February 28th. That night at 1:40 local time, the first Israeli F-35s crossed into Iranian airspace. 40 minutes later, American B-2 Spirit bombers completed their long cold arcs from Diego Garcia. The strike was devastating, and decision-makers in Tehran already had their response calculated. It was not a question of whether they would respond. That had been written into IRGC doctrine for years. The only variable was how to impose the maximum possible cost without triggering a response that would consume what remained of Iran's military apparatus in a single night. They chose the aircraft carrier, and the logic behind that choice deserves to be broken down. An aircraft carrier is not simply a military target. It is a symbol with specific arithmetic attached to it. The USS Gerald R. Ford represents $13.3 billion in steel alone. Its embarked air wing adds another $5 billion. The 5,200 people on board cost the United States a decade and several $1 million each to train. Damaging that ship does not change a conflict because of the metal lost. It changes it because of what it tells every government watching, that U.S. aircraft carriers can be hit. That message reaches Japan, reaches South Korea, reaches Taiwan, reaches every nation that built its security on the premise that the United States Navy is the unquestioned guarantor of the international order. Iran understood this with surgical precision. They had understood it for 20 years. Now the composition of the salvo, because they were not 74 of the same type, and it was a deliberate mix. 41 had 3 variants, flying depressed trajectory profiles to maximize terminal velocity. 17 Fate 1313 solid fuel missiles fired from coastal platforms, leveraging shorter flight times to compress the available interception window, and 16 Zulfikar 2s equipped with maneuverable reentry vehicles, tested only twice before that moment and whose terminal guidance signatures had been carefully concealed from American surveillance satellites. The maneuverable ones were the dangerous ones. Not because 16 missiles alone saturate any defense, but because a maneuverable reentry vehicle turns interception, which is normally a solvable algebra problem, into 3-dimensional chess played at Mach 4. You can no longer extend the ballistic line and place your interceptor there. The target moves, and when it moves at hypersonic speed through the upper atmosphere, the window for a lethal interception shrinks to fractions of a second. Both sides had done that math. The question was whether the calculations matched reality when 74 objects appeared simultaneously on the same radar screens. Let's go to the fight. The Ford's Combat Direction Center detected launch signatures at 3017, and here's a key detail. It was not the ship's radar that gave the first warning. It was SBIRS, the space-based infrared system that detected the thermal bloom of ballistic missile engines igniting and transmitted the detection to fleet units within seconds. The strike group reacted immediately, and the AEGIS system on the cruiser USS Bunker Hill began calculating interception solutions before a human being had processed what the screens were showing. SM-3 Block 2-way missiles, kinetic kill vehicles without explosive warheads, just metal moving at Mach 15. Vertical launch in 90 seconds. The first Iranian missile died at 71 miles altitude, 340 nautical miles from the Ford. By the time that debris cloud was dispersing, 4 SM-3 interceptions had already succeeded. 17 missiles survived that first defensive layer. 11 of them were conventional Shahab variants, predictable in their terminal phase. SM-2s took care of fate. 3 reached the inner defense perimeter, but the 6 maneuverable Zulfikars were an entirely different problem. One executed a 12-degree azimuth change at 68,000 feet, enough to force a recalculation that consumed 2 interceptors instead of 1. A second Zulfikar maneuvered at 55,000 feet. The SM-2 passed within 40 meters and detonated its proximity fuse. The fragmentation damaged the reentry vehicle's guidance electronics, but did not destroy the structure. The vehicle continued descending, partially blind, still supersonic, still pointing more or less toward the Ford. And the tactical action officer saw a single track symbol continue its descent on the screen after an interception that should have resolved it. He had 4 seconds to make a decision. CIWS free. All close-in weapon systems free. The Ford's 4 Phalanx Gatling guns converged on the track. The damaged Zulfikar detonated 340 meters above the water, 686 meters off the port bow, and a fragment struck the ship's sponson, leaving a 10-centimeter mark in the steel. No crew injured, no systems damaged. The Ford had been struck by debris from a missile that had already ceased to be a missile. In the history of U.S. carrier operations, that barely qualifies as an incident. Yet it will appear in the curriculum of every naval war college on the planet for the next decade, because what it represents is proof of concept. The maneuverable re-entry vehicle came close enough to leave a mark, and that, in strategic terms, does not fade. The entire engagement lasted 9 minutes and 47 seconds. Of the 74 missiles launched, 69 were destroyed in the various defensive layers. 3 impacted the water less than 2 nautical miles from the ship. 2 were eliminated in the terminal zone. 1 left shrapnel in the sponson. 0 U.S. casualties. The Ford did not even alter course. In narrow-metrics, it was an absolute American tactical success. But narrow-metrics do not tell the whole story, and this is where it becomes uncomfortable. The Ford strike group expended 63 interceptors during those 9 minutes. SM-3s, SM-2s, evolved Sea Sparrows, Phalanx rounds. In logistics, they immediately began calculating consumption rate against available resupply inventory. Replenishing a carrier strike group's missile magazines takes weeks. The nearest facility was Bahrain, which Iran had attacked simultaneously with a separate salvo, considerably complicating that timeline. And now let's talk about the number that really matters, the exchange ratio. Iran spent approximately $180 million firing those 74 missiles. The U.S. defensive response cost between $900 million and $1.3 billion in interceptors. Every time Iran fires and the United States defends, Iran spends $1 and the United States spends between 5 and 7. Iranian planners had studied exactly this dynamic during the conflict in Ukraine, watching how Russian drone salvos drained Ukrainian interceptor magazines. They learned the correct lesson. The objective was never to sink the Ford. The objective was to force a continuous and costly defense until maintaining the carrier's presence became the story instead of the campaign it was supposed to enable. Iran still had 700 missiles in inventory. If this is blowing your mind, like and subscribe. What comes next is just as dense. The American response began 47 minutes after the last track symbol disappeared from the screens. 44 Tomahawks launched from the destroyer screen, targeting the 9 launch sites retrospectively tracked from the flight paths of the Iranian missiles themselves. Because a mobile launcher that fires reveals its position. The problem is that many had already moved. 14 strikes hit active or recently evacuated positions. The rest struck empty ground. The Ford's air wing launched its first strike package at 5001 night. F-35Cs targeting the fixed infrastructure supporting Iran's Western missile network. Not the launchers themselves, but the nervous system they depend on. Fuel, maintenance, command authority. Degrading that takes weeks, not hours. And that is exactly the strategy, not chasing trucks in the desert, but cutting what makes those trucks function. By mid-morning on March 1st, the pattern was visible to anyone watching the full picture instead of individual events. Iran had launched the most significant ballistic missile attack against U.S. naval forces in history. Tactically defeated, 0 casualties. And at the same time, Iran had demonstrated that its maneuverable reentry vehicle works, that its mass-salvo doctrine stresses defenses, and that the exchange ratio bleeds the defender faster than the attacker. Oil markets opened at $178 per barrel. The Strait of Hormuz remained technically open. China called for restraint. Russia said absolutely nothing. Nuclear negotiations in Vienna were formally suspended. The post-action analysis will be studied in every naval war college on the planet. They will find a 93% interception rate, extraordinary, representative of decades of investment in missile defense. They will also find that the 7% penetration came specifically from the threat category in which Iran had invested most heavily, against a salvo of 74 missiles, 74 missiles, 74 missiles in the terminal zone. On a different night, with different warheads, that is an entirely different story. The lesson Iran draws, the maneuverable reentry vehicle works, build more. And the lesson U.S. planners draw, 74 missiles cost more to defend than to fire, and the next salvo will be larger. Neither lesson points toward a short conflict. The Ford is still there. The flight deck resumed operations 22 minutes after the last incoming track was resolved, and the tactical action officer wrote his post-action report in the neutral language of a man who knew his words would be read by people who were not in that compartment, who did not see that single track continue descending after the interception that should have stopped it. He wrote, "Successful defensive engagement. Future engagements assessed as probable." He did not write the number occupying every mind in front of those screens. Not the missiles destroyed, the missiles remaining. The carriers are in position, the missiles are loaded, the negotiations vanished. History watches, as always, with complete indifference to how this is supposed to end. If you made it this far, you already know this kind of analysis is not found just anywhere. Subscribe, activate the bell so you do not miss any video, and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. Share this video with someone who needs to understand what is really happening in the Persian Gulf. See you in the next one.